At 5:04 p.m. Korean Standard Time on July 6, 2013, Asiana Airlines Flight 214 departed from Incheon International Airport on its way to San Francisco International Airport with 307 people on board. It began its descent after it was cleared for a visual approach to runway 28 at 11:21 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time. The pilots began to land 1.5 miles away from the runway, however, their approach was too slow and too low. Passengers noticed that the plane was unusually close to the water, and the instructor pilot called for an increase in speed, but it was already too late. At 11:28 a.m., OZ-214's landing gear and tail hit the seawall of San Francisco Bay and crashed short of the runway threshold. The tail section and left engine were torn off. As the plane spun and slid into the runway, the vertical and horizontal stabilizers also broke off. The wreckage came to a rest 2,400 feet away from the initial point of impact. Then, a dark plume of smoke rose from it. A fuel tank had ruptured and was leaking oil onto the still hot right engine. Despite the extensive damage to the aircraft, most of the passengers were not critically injured and evacuated via the emergency slides. 187 people were injured, 49 of them seriously so, and 3 people died. An investigation into the accident was conducted by the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB. Flight 214 was manned by 3 experienced pilots. The Boeing 777-200ER had a stellar safety record. The weather conditions in San Francisco were nearly perfect the morning of the crash, and no mechanical failure was the plane was discovered.
They concluded that the root cause of the crash was the pilot's mismanagement of the flight's final approach. An instrument-led descent was not viable because the glide slope of runway 28L at the San Francisco airport was out of service that morning. The plane's path during the approach was too low, so the pilots turned on autopilot for course correction. Unbeknownst to them, the autothrottle did not control the speed of the plane in the mode that they activated, even though they set it to the correct reference speed. As a result, the plane slowed down too much and dropped too low. The engine stalled as the pilots tried to pull up. Then the plane crashed. The pilots' over-reliance on technology was apparent. They had difficulty controlling the approach even before the final descent. In fact, the autothrottle was suppressed only because the pilots were unable to manually maintain the proper course and resorted to activating the autopilot. Had they been skilled at flying by hand, as commercial pilots are expected to be, the accident could have been avoided. In addition, no pilot should be confused when a critical system performs as it is designed to. All of these indicate that the pilots acted irresponsibly and neglected their professional code of ethics. The NTSB investigators concluded that the pilots were primarily responsible for the disaster, and they were held accountable. 2 pilots were demoted to ground crew jobs, and the other 2 who played lesser roles returned to flying.
Cockpit and pilot culture also played a role in the crash. The crew suffered from an increased workload to try to meet the demands of international air travel. They were fatigued by the end of the flight, then placed under pressure when they were expected to perform a visual approach. Investigators also cited crew resource management and lack of compliance with standard operating procedures as causes of the crash. Since 3 experienced pilots were in the cockpit, Asiana Airlines training standards were brought into question. In interviews after the accident, pilots said that they strongly relied on automated systems and rarely flew manually. Their automation policy also emphasized fully utilizing automated systems and discouraged manual flight, highlighting the root of their pilots' heavy reliance on technology. Thus, Asiana Airlines was also responsible for the accidents. The company acted unethically in several ways that put their passengers' safety at risk. Their demanding schedule negatively impacted the pilots' performance, and they did not properly prepare them for routine scenarios, such as runways, vertical guidance systems being out of service. Following the National Transportation Safety Board's investigation, Asiana Airlines employed preventative ethics to avoid similar accidents from happening. Their training committee expanded instructions on topics such as visual landings. Officials sought methods to enhance crew communication and resource management, reducing cockpit confusion and fatigue risk. The airline took on the brunt of legal and financial accountability. On August 12, 2013, They announced that they would pay $10,000 to survivors and additional compensation to the families of the passengers who lost their lives. Multiple lawsuits were filed against the airline by passengers for an extensive litany of errors and omissions related to their training and safety standards. They were also fined $500,000 by the United States Department of Transportation for failing to keep victims and their families updated on the crash.
While the cause of the crash was not a mechanical error, Boeing bears some responsibility. Some officials believe that the pilot's assumption that autopilot would not suppress the autothrottle to be reasonable, and the NTSB determined that the complexities of the autothrottle and autopilot flight director systems were inadequately described in Boeing's documentation. Lawsuits and dozens of claims were filed against Boeing. Ethically speaking, Boeing did meet the standard of care while engineering the 777, as evidenced by its exceptional safety reputation. However, oversights were made in its design and documentation. The disaster could have been prevented if there was any indication that the autothrottle had been disabled. On July 30th, 2013, a bill was passed to implement an automatic verbal warning for low airspeed to prevent similar accidents from taking place.
Unfortunately, this was not the last time an Asiana Airlines flight crashed during a manual descent. On April 14, 2015, Asiana Airlines Flight 162 crashed when it tried to land without an instrument landing system. Investigators determined that the first officer did not call for a go-around immediately when he could not see the runway. They also determined that it was probable that Asiana Airlines pilot training was insufficient. Although the circumstances are more understandable, where the crew was trying to land a smaller aircraft during a storm at night and nobody died, the accident shows that Flight 214's problems were not resolved. Pilots relying too heavily on automated systems is not limited to Asiana Airlines. In fact, American Airlines warned pilots that overdependence on automation is a well-known problem in a 1997 training video. In 2009, Air France Flight 447 crashed, killing all 228 occupants shortly after its autopilot shut off. Nervous and confused, the pilot was unable to manually control the aircraft, and it entered a stall before plunging into the Atlantic Ocean. These disasters present a significant ethical dilemma. Is the increasing amount of automation in airplanes dangerously damaging the skills of pilots? Regardless of factors such as pilots' fatigue and inclement weather, the Asiana flights would not have crashed if the pilots were more skilled at manual descents. The pilots of Air France Flight 447, who have even been described as hideously incompetent, immediately lost control after they took manual control of the plane, demonstrating their inability to fly without autopilot. Similar failures will continue to occur 20 years in the future and beyond. There will be less situations where pilots must take manual control as automated systems become even more advanced. Consequently, the risk of failure is drastically increased when those systems are unavailable. Airlines and regulators can try to counteract this phenomenon by upping training standards. But the underlying problem is that pilots lack practical experiences with manual flight.
The precision and convenience of autopilot is indispensable in modern aviation, so the alternative is to learn from failures and carry on improving aircraft. After the Asiana Airlines Flight 214 crash, Boeing revised their flight systems to verbally warn pilots when a plane slowed to dangerous speeds. After the Air France Flight 447 disaster, Airbus discovered and corrected malfunctioning airspeed sensors in some of their A330s. Eventually, automated flight will be so advanced that pilots play only a minor role in commercial air travel. If a situation where pilots must take manual control of the plane no longer exists, then there is no longer a risk for them to crash one.